So for those of you who have stayed here all day with me, you have heard from some of the most brilliant minds in the world. We've spoken to Stellar, Danelle Dixon. We talked to Monica Long at Ripple. We talked to Pascal from Ledger. And we talked to Sergey from OneInch. Now it's a pleasure to talk about one of the leading brands in the Web3 ecosystem. Here to talk about culture. Now you might ask yourself, how does culture fit into Web3? Let's bring up Yat to tell us exactly this process and where culture will remain. Let's bring him up. Yat from Animoca Brands.
So thank you for your time. My name is Yat. I'm chairman and co-founder of Animoca Brands. And as mentioned, I'm here to talk about why culture is so important to Web3 and why we think it's going to be perhaps the most important thing that's going to help grow the space. So I'm trying to get the slides up and start off with that. Hello, slides? There you go. Culture is the foundation of Web3. So let me first quickly start off. For those of you who are not that familiar with us, we are actually a builder in the space. We've been doing this for the last 5 years, which seems like an eternity. But we also are investors through mostly out of our balance sheet. So today we actually have over 420 portfolio companies. Some of the companies you might have heard of, like OpenSea or Yugo Labs, Cool Cats, Gamey, Sandbox, a whole bunch of companies in the space that have basically sort of helped grow the Web3 ecosystem. And for us, this topic is really important because we do a lot in the intersection of culture in that area. Oh, this is a slightly older slide. Never mind. So, okay. So basically, you all know what Web3 is. Web3 is about giving people property rights in the internet. And so it starts with the foundation, basically, of the rights that we have online, basically the data paradigm that we have. And we think of public blockchains as the national economies of the metaverse. And what we mean by that is that whether it's an L1, L2, whether it's something like a sandbox, we think of them as an economy. So the structure is in economic terms. So what drives economies? Well, first of all, what drives economies is a form of digital property, right? If you think about the way that your own economies work, they're actually based on sort of the right to own your property, your house, your car, all these things. And non-fungible tokens in the Web3 space represent that. They represent that basically as a way in which you own your property in the digital space, basically through blockchain. And since this is a blockchain event, I don't have to describe to you how blockchain works, which is nice. But one of the big things, of course, that happens, what you can do in Web3 that you couldn't actually do in the sort of traditional Web2 space, is that the value that's generated from the time that you spend online from that digital property comes from data, which is the most valuable resource on the web, on the internet. In fact, the most powerful countries in the powerful companies in the world are the ones who control all of our data. And this data creates blocks of information, and then they become knowledge. They become valuable pieces of knowledge that have network effects. In the Web2 paradigm, that network effect does not belong to us. It belongs to the platform, because they pay for that. But in the Web3 paradigm, because we pay for gas or we pay for royalties in NFT space, we share that cost across. We also therefore are entitled to the derivative network effects that come from that, which I'll go into a little bit later. So let's quickly talk about why we think culture is so important, coming from the lens that we think everything in the metaverse should be viewed in economic terms like running a country. So this is the US. Last year, in what you could count as a pretty big bear market, arts and culture, that's people working in the arts and culture industry, service industry, like actors or artists or musicians, accounted for close to $900 billion in terms of the economic output. The largest one being retail and trade, like people buying clothes and that kind of stuff. So that's a pretty big number, very important. But when you consider actually on the foundation what arts and culture really represents, it is far greater than just the people who work on it. Because when you think about all the clothes that you buy, the cars that you buy, the houses that you purchase, much of that retail and trade or outdoor recreation, I know North Face or whatever the thing you buy, that actually is culture. When people talk about outdoor, they don't just talk about something as a utility, they also talk about the culture of hiking or the culture of sport. This actually all falls into it. In other words, the foundation of the US economy is principally based on culture. If you don't actually, and this is true for every country in the world. We're in France, you could argue a capital of culture in many, many ways, whether it's music, fashion, and so on. If it wasn't for culture, you wouldn't have Disney, you wouldn't have Hollywood, you wouldn't have Netflix, you wouldn't have LVMH, you wouldn't have PlayStation. None of these things exist if it wasn't for culture. So culture, from our perspective, is the absolute foundation of any economy of any country in the world. The traditions that we do, whether it's Christmas, buying presents, or whatever it is that we do, all form part of that. And this is true for every country in the world, meaning that if you want to have a healthy economy, you need to have a strong foundation of culture. Now, I often give this example because a lot of times people, I think this audience will know it better. This is, a Birkin bag. Compare that to a Bored Ape. Bored Apes are really famous as social identifiers of some sort. And when I took that comparison, the Bored Ape was the same value as a Birkin bag. Now a Bored Ape is much more valuable than a Birkin bag. But the reason I illustrate this is how much of the reason why you purchase that bag is because of its utility. The answer is perhaps less than 1%. And that is true for everything we do in the physical world as well. People, when they buy a car, there's a utility, of course, to drive the car. But when you make a decision to buy that car, you're not actually buying it because it can take you from point A to point B. You're choosing to buy it for its cultural aspects, for its network effects, for what it means social. Otherwise, we should be buying the cheapest possible cars, and we should all be wearing black shoes and very practical utilitarian outfits, rather than actually all these things that become part of our identity. So the value that you're actually purchasing in all the cultural items of the world today, which is in retail and trade, are 99.9% virtual in construct anyway. There are stories, there are imagination, there are things that mean something to us that are feelings that are intangible. And so when you take that into non-fungible tokens, actually the stretch isn't that far, which is arguably 100% virtual, but really all the value exists in the virtual plane to begin with. And this is true for everything that we do, that we purchase today. And one of the powerful things that happens in the traditional space, which is now possible in the digital space, is that you have the ability to have interoperability. Now, what interoperability really means in the Web3 construct is the ability to have ownership economics and the ability to transfer items and have the freedom to transact from one platform to the other. What we mean by that, though, is not that it's designed for another platform, rather that you have the freedom to do whatever you want with it, and the owner of that asset has the freedom to compose new experiences on top of it as they wish. Before I go into this slide, the example here would be that because we have ownership in the physical world, you actually have the ability to create new products and services on top of that. Think of, for instance, the fact that you own a car. You have the ability to have Uber or Lyft or people who make baby seats. Or the fact that you own an iPhone is the reason why a case company can exist or headphone companies can come around and create new products without needing permission from the creators of it. And so when it comes to social status and other identifiers, one of the reasons that we see here, for instance, with Sandbox or Life Beyond, is a case where people buy virtual land. Now, often, again, land itself, where you live, is culture. You choose to live in France, so you're a French citizen. A form of nationalism or patriotism, depending which lens you want to take it from, is also a part of culture. Even the district you choose to live in, whether it is something that is high-end or something that is of a certain area, is part of your culture. You want to live in this place because of your family or because of the people who are there. So location matters, but not the fact that it gets you from point A to point B faster. It just means something to you from a cultural perspective. And virtual land has been one of the first things that people really began to understand, and one of the reasons why Sandbox really took off in the areas of imagination and storytelling in this area, because land is part of our home, it's part of our culture. And the same is true for what we see in the PFP movement, because these NFTs, these funny JPEGs, as some people would say, they are membership, yes, but they also speak to our identity. They are things no different than what we do, for instance, in buying fashion items, for instance. Do we really need thousands of luxury fashion brands or hundreds of different sort of sportswear brands? We don't really need them, but we still want them because they have different types of identities. They mean things different to us. They are part of a culture that we connect with. And you'll find that with those communities in sort of the non-fungible token areas, like with PFPs, that there are people who might prefer Bored Apes because they're part of that community. They might like CryptoPunks, or they might like, Cool Cats. Whatever it is, it speaks to the particular culture that they want to connect with. And culture is really, really critical here because it's something that you don't want to give away when it's part of you. I'll come to that later. So I come to this part where Web3 aligns network participants. You know this already. It creates a better incentive layer where people can connect with each other and grow the network together. So this is a good example. Most people may not remember that, for instance, you could buy the first piece of land in Sandbox for something like $25, or that Bored Apes were minted at $200. This may appear just as an opportunity economically to say, oh, you got in cheap, and therefore, you had the benefit of the upside. That's one financial way to look at it. But the other way, which is what we prefer, which we think is actually more meaningful, is that actually you get to become a network participant in the growth of Sandbox or in the growth of something like Bored Apes, because you're purchasing something at a low price of a project that needs your help as a network participant to help grow it. And as a result of that, you gain equity through the ownership of this project because you now own this NFT. You're no longer just a consumer. So think of it differently. In the physical world, let's say we all buy Nike shoes because we saw the advertising and we are incentivized to buy a Nike shoe. Every time you're out there wearing a Nike shoe and someone sees it, you are creating brand equity for Nike, with your own money, by the way. So you're a consumer. But in so doing, you give value to Nike or Adidas or any other brand, Prada, whatever luxury brand you can think of. When you talk about it, you're actually making the brand bigger, which is great. But what do you get for it? So Web3 aligns the interest because now I can measure that. I'm able to say, oh, I helped promote this, I helped create a network effect, and I'm also, as a result, a part owner of that success. That is why PFP as a movement has grown the way that it has, and why you need things like royalties in order to sustain its growth, because if you don't have that, then they would have to charge you the price of what it might be worth in the future, which means you can't participate in supporting that growth. And a quick sort of side turn, and we do the same with teachers. This is something called TinyTap, where people are able to create the same kind of network effects where teachers basically create content that creates income from the teaching content. And again, you can participate and help grow that by becoming a co-publisher. Now this is, again, where blockchain and Web3 is really fascinating, because normally if you have a piece of content that makes $1,000 a year, you wouldn't be able to sell it to someone for a kind of capital formation value that you get in Web3. Like, let's say, even if it was worth 10 or 20% yield, you might sell it for maybe $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 for something that makes $1,000. Because the traditional way of doing it is you have to sign a contract, you have to get a lawyer involved, you have to sign papers, you have to sort of do all this stuff. The cost of the transaction is just too high. But in Web3, what you're now able to do is, even for things that might only be making $10 or $20 or $30, because the transfer of an NFT essentially is the equivalent of the whole contract obligation and rights that comes with it, means that you can actually create capital formation even for things that are only worth dollars or cents, as we see with teacher content. So we expect that to happen more broadly. So I want to close a little bit on gaming, because gaming is the biggest digital culture in the world today. 20 years ago, gaming was a $6 billion industry. That wasn't too bad. And today, it's over $200 billion, larger than music and film combined. There's 3.4 billion people who play games today, and the number is only rising because all the kids who play games today will continue to play games as they get older. There's about 5 billion plus people online today, so it gives you an idea of the scale we're talking about here. So it is the big culture. But what's also interesting about the gaming culture is that over $100 billion actually, well, more than a year ago, was spent on virtual items. So not only do they understand the value of virtual goods from their perspective, what's also interesting is that it is mostly cosmetic. Now, I had this conversation with someone else who's not from the industry, and they were like, isn't it because it gives you superpowers or it makes you better? People who are not in a gaming space might assume that, but that is not true. When you play Fortnite, for instance, or PUBG, or any of those popular games you hear about, you're buying entirely cosmetic items. You're buying culture, $100 billion of virtual culture. You're not buying something that makes you better or stronger, because if it does, it messes up the balance of the game. Imagine playing a game of chess and your whole board is full of queens. That's not fun. So you all have to have the same level playing field, but you have the ability to make your chess pieces attractive. They could be pink, they could be blue, they could have characters on it. That's what people are paying for, $100 billion and growing. But they're rental, meaning they're not owned by the users. That's why we're focusing on the gaming industry, because we think gamers not only understand this, you can have the benefit of capital formation in this environment where we're already spending $100 billion plus. The other thing about gaming is that it is a digital-first culture, meaning that the intrinsic desire and demand from using these products comes from the digital plane, which is why things like gaming, we think, is the ideal sort of segue into this. And as we've seen already, gaming has an entire industry in itself, which can now be translated into the metaverse. It's developers, it's creators, it's people who do esports, right? There's peripheral businesses all around it. Just on that point, for those of you who are gamers, or even if you don't know about gaming, the fact that you have a great NVIDIA graphic card, or the fact that you have curved screens, or gamer chairs, as they call it, is only because of the gaming industry. If the gaming industry didn't exist, you wouldn't have these devices. They actually were the foundation of many of the innovations that we use today, even if we don't appreciate it that it came from gaming first. So I want to sort of just give an illustration here as to how Web3 changes this. In the gaming industry, of that $100 billion that I just described, it comes from less than 3% conversion. So a very small number of users actually convert. The majority play for free. And a lot of commentary has been given in the past about things like play to earn. Really what happens in play to earn is that the value comes from the people who basically play for people who pay on the 3 percentile. The 97 to 99% of people who don't play for free. But what they actually do is they think it's fun, but they induce the 1 to 3% to play. Because after all, it would be kind of boring to enter a world to play with nobody. You have to have someone to create that incentive. And so play to earn solves that. There's only one component of ownership rights. But the other one, which is even bigger, is the marketing side of things. Last year, over $100 billion was spent in what we call in-app advertising. This is where you pay for advertising in something like Google, Apple, or Facebook, and they, it's cost per install. The average cost per install is $86 per paid user. So unless your game can make more than, if your game can make more than $86 per user, you're good. But the number of games in the world that can do that is very, very small, which is why gaming has become sort of, somewhat in traditional terms, a zero-sum game. But there's another point here, which is that of the $100+ billion in app installs that has taken place, how much, which has all gone to Google and Apple and Facebook and those companies, goes back into the gaming industry? In the Web2 world, almost nothing. Google doesn't invest in games. Apple doesn't develop games. These companies don't do that. That's not their business model. So they take all that value. So the $200 billion that the entire gaming industry does, half of it goes to advertising, which doesn't go back into the ecosystem. Another 30% goes to the platform for fees. Actually, there's not that much left, relatively speaking. So again, in Web3, from a cultural perspective as well, it allows you basically to share that value. When you give someone a low-cost NFT or a free NFT, for instance, what you're doing is you're capturing the user early on, almost like in exchange for an advertising cost. So it's not truly free, because instead of paying $5 million in advertising to the platform, you're giving away millions of dollars maybe of potentially valuable NFTs for someone else, with one difference: the community gets to grow it with you. If you know how to grow the right community, that's how they bring it up. And that's the difference between the cultural items in the metaverse that succeed versus the ones that don't. So, I've already talked about how culture is the foundation of economies. Therefore, we think of culture as the foundation of Web3. Creators are the backbone of all culture. So we're all basically people who contribute to culture. And culture is the backbone of the economies, as I demonstrated. And therefore, in Web3, we think culture is the backbone of the metaverse. And I want to close with this thought here as well. I didn't touch on this too much, but I started off earlier with it's all about digital property rights. And meaning that the digital property rights isn't only about the ability to own a piece of land, whether it's virtual or physical, it's also the intellectual property right that comes with it. So areas of culture is intellectual property rights, whether it's movies or film or TV, for instance, in the physical world, that's also a form of intellectual copyright. And this intellectual property, when it's respected, can allow for capital formation to develop, as we've seen in the physical world. And the same is possible in the digital world. meaning that if I can truly own something, I can basically have capital formation and have more value. And you can see the countries that have very low property rights, on the extreme side, places like North Korea, have very, very low GDPs. And every country, including places like France or the US or maybe Hong Kong, that has very strong property rights, has very, very high GDPs. Because you can invest in the long term. You can buy a house and a bank will give you a mortgage for 20 or 30 years. You can invest in making software or making an invention and know that it can be protected so that someone will pay you value for it in the future. That's the basis. Property rights are fundamental to both the physical world and the digital world. And it happens to be that also all those places that have strong property rights also have strong liberties. So in closing, oh, sorry, one more slide. So I just wanted to illustrate, this is the wrong slide, but I just, so just hear me out. Last year, NFT sales was $24 billion in what was apparently a bear market, of which 90% of that value was paid out to owners and creators. Now, by that, I mean that the platform didn't make 90% of the value. It was the owners of the NFTs, as in they own the property, or the creators, as in through royalties. So roughly $22 billion. Spotify, which is the largest music royalty streaming service in the world, paid out $7 billion to all their musicians last year. Except in Web3, we only have millions of people in the space, but Spotify has over 300 million subscribers or listeners or whatever you want to call it. So the point being that it's a perfect example how in the Web 2 paradigm, you're worth only cents or microcents per user, but in Web 3, because of property rights, you are worth much more. And so you can just imagine what happens in a space where property rights becomes ubiquitous across the billions of users around the world. We're not talking about a space that is worth just additional few billions. This will be $1 trillion economy in the same way that physical economies have grown through actual property rights. So, usual closing statement. George Washington said freedom and property rights are inseparable. You can't have one without the other, and the same is true for digital. Thank you.